All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we're going to look at now some of the consequences of the exploration, European exploration of many parts of the world, particularly the western side of the Atlantic, as well as the African coastlines and the routes to India and the Spice Islands, as well as China. In this first of a two-part lecture series, we're going to look at the Portuguese trade empire in Africa and Asia. Portugal, of course, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas, controlled territories to the east of the demarcation line that was negotiated by the popes in the early 1490s. And so, therefore, Portugal will dominate most European contact with the West African coast and India and Indonesia, as we'll see. Their trade post at Almina will be a major source of gold for Europeans during this time. And by the middle of the 1480s, by the late 15th century, they were actively negotiating with the kingdoms along the West African coastline, the in the Niger River basin, which would supply commodities like pepper, ivory, and later slaves. The Portuguese supplied to these territories um, materials like copper, brass, glass, and textiles, particularly in the areas of metallurgy. That is where Africa was sort of resource poor, and so the Portuguese trade, the European trade from Portugal, was rather timely. The Portuguese also engaged in a number of missionary efforts. Um, Initially, the Portuguese attempt to simply convert the kings and rulers of the tribes and kingdoms and empires of Western Africa. In Benin, this was not so successful. However, further south and in more central parts of Africa, like in the Kingdom of Congo, the missionary efforts were somewhat more successful as the Portuguese worked with the royal families. Catholicism in the Kingdom of Congo did become the official state religion. Um, the problem, of course, for the African peoples was is that the rulers assumed that if they adopted Christianity, that they would be treated as equals by the Europeans, equally suited to negotiate treaties, trade deals, etc. And they would later find that this was not so. As a result, Christianity would either be somewhat ephemeral or while maintaining itself as a quasi-official religion, would never really sink deep roots. What the Portuguese really pioneered in West Africa was the slave trade. As we said before, slavery was already something that existed in Africa as it existed in Asia and as it existed in parts of Europe. The slave trade that we're talking about here, however, is one of scale. Um, and the nature of the servitude. In most cases, in ancient medieval world, slavery was a question of um, uh, conquered peoples serving as house servants, or sometimes as farm laborers in those of the conquered people. In some cases, among the Greeks and among the Romans, slavery in mining activities and quarrying especially uh, could be used as a punishment. But then there could be people who were actually um, uh, free citizens of Rome who could be, through criminal processes and procedures, could be found guilty and banished to servitude in the mines. The slave trade began to increase in the 16th century because as the sugar plantations in the Americas began to be established. Early on, there was a form of indentured servitude of white Europeans who were seeking to go to the New World, would allow themselves to become indentured servants for a period of 20 to 30 years or so. Um, that worked in some places, not in others. Um, In some parts of the New World, the Spanish and the Portuguese both tried to enslave the native population. That didn't work out so well. And so the West African connection became the solution, um, alas. Early on, Benin supplied most of the slaves, some slaves, but really it was Congo further south that lacked a lot of resources, and therefore the great resource that they could sell to the Portuguese were slaves in exchange for all those textiles and metals and so forth. And the kings of Congo possessed a royal monopoly on slavery, so they could acquire the slaves from local wars with smaller tribes, and then they would sell the slaves to the Portuguese. However, that began to slip as warfare became more um, uh, continuous throughout Africa as a result of the increasing demand for slaves creates an unending cycle of war. The king's power and authority begins to wane, and as a result, there are several rebellions, and Congo collapses into a kind of anarchy. Okay. And so the Portuguese simply move on. If there isn't a good supply of slaves coming from Congo, then they will simply seek more hospitable salesmen further south. In East Africa, the situation is somewhat different because there the Portuguese encounter small, somewhat powerful Muslim states that have already well established trade links across the Indian Ocean. As in Malindi, these states see an advantage in allying with the Portuguese over and against other local kingdoms. In some cases, it's the Islamic states that are the aggressors, as with the Empire of Ethiopia in and around the Horn of Africa, along the Red Sea. They were under increasing pressure from the Ottomans. As a fact, the Ottomans nearly overrun Ethiopia in the 16th century. So the Portuguese provide some naval resources, and alongside the Ethiopian army are able to save that kingdom, which supplies Portugal with a relatively um, hospitable ally in the East African region. However, the a grand alliance between Portugal and Ethiopia is never struck, much to the chagrin actually of the Ethiopians, who saw the Portuguese as a real counterweight against the power of the Ottomans. uh, in the Western Indian Ocean, the products of Portugal did not impress. Uh, the Portuguese naval resources, however, were far more impressive. So, as in India in particular, when the Indian states of the Mughal Empire did not, weren't impressed by the Portuguese, did not want to trade with the Portuguese, they simply forced their way in with their very powerful warships. So by 1505, there were a number of Swahili coast ports that fall. 5 years later, Goa on the Gujarat coast of India, which is a bit further north on the west coast of India, falls to the Portuguese and will remain in Portuguese hands for centuries. And then Hormuz in 1515, which guards the entryway into the Persian Gulf, falls to the Portuguese as well. So they really create a vast network of trade posts. These are not colonies. All right, they are merely heavily armed trade posts across the Western Indian Ocean. In the Eastern Indian Ocean, there is a similar story. Again, the Portuguese fight their way in. The key city of Malacca, which sits on the along the Straits of Malacca between the Malay Peninsula and Indonesia, was seized by the Portugals forcibly again in 1511. As a result, the trade between China and India now is controlled by a European power. It'll be the Portuguese now. A century later, it will be the Dutch. Regardless, many um, of the other eastern states who trade in the Indian Ocean recognize this new kid on the block, so to speak, and therefore the Chinese allow them to establish a trade post at Macau about 6 years after the seizure of Malacca to diffuse tensions and continue to facilitate trade. The Portuguese then will become responsible for not only bringing goods um, uh, back to Europe from the Indies and become one of the major interlocutors, sort of intermediaries between Europe and the East Indies, but also the Portuguese will start to facilitate trade among Eastern Indian and Chinese states as well. Okay, so they start to manage the trade there. In so doing, they acquire a monopoly on spices, and they also create their own sort of customs system in the East from which they make profits. And the customs system entails things like transporting certain goods. That will make quite a large profit. So it's not actually selling any goods, but simply hauling it, managing it. All the instruments that facilitate trade will be managed by the Portuguese. And again, as I said, later in a later century, the Dutch will pick up a similar set of monopolies and trade advantages. And here we see essentially the Portuguese Empire, and it doesn't really look like much. Outside of Brazil and some territories in southern Africa, what you see mostly are little dots along the coastlines, and that's really how they made their money. It was, again, a global trade empire that was not a land empire. It was run by their navies. Of course, there were reactions to the Portuguese. The Indian and Chinese emperors really didn't think much of them. Of course, at sea, the Portuguese were a significant threat, and you know, that had to be sort of dealt with and endured. On land, however, the Portuguese did not field any great empires, or excuse me, land armies that could threaten these empires in any way. And in the case of India, at the time that the Portuguese were entering into the Indian system, it was still quite strong under the rule of the Mughal emperors. That will change very significantly after 1700 when Mughal decline and the Mughal Empire declines sufficiently, and the British are able to insert themselves, the British and the French, and play off the warring Indian states against one another. But for the time being, the Portuguese are not much of a threat to either India or China. The Ottomans did, in fact, mount serious opposition, but the Portuguese ocean-going fleets were no match, really, for the Ottomans. Um, and the Ottomans did, again, after about 1500, did develop a very powerful navies, but it was a kind of a generational one-hit wonder, so to speak. The smaller states along the Indian coast did, in fact, resist and eventually came under Portuguese influence. Um, but when they did, the Portuguese would use all the tools at their disposal, including force, in some cases, an embargo as against Calicut, and eventually the Gujarat state, just sort of being barraged by the Portuguese, having so much territory seized, allowed them to build a stronghold at Diu, which really consolidates by 1535 Portuguese hold on sort of that north central coast region of the west coast of India. Okay. In doing all of this, the Portuguese really end up breaking what had been the Italian monopoly on the pepper trade, on the spice trade, which we had talked about before, where the Iberian states really were cut off by the Genoese and the Venetians in particular, the Neapolitans as well, from really accessing the trade, the major ports of call in the Eastern Mediterranean, where these products were all sold. Now, Portugal has gone directly to the source and has created a vast trade network that is able to bring these goods back to Europe, and will really provide, in sort of the vision of Prince Henry the Navigator, a source of power and a sense of prosperity for the Portuguese state. Once that economic prowess is established, then the Portuguese are actually able to go and more aggressively colonize Brazil, creating another vast money pump in sugar. And they will also become one of the leading producers of sugar in the um, uh, in the Atlantic world. All right, that is all for the Portuguese Empire after exploration. In the next lecture, we'll look at what's going on with the Spanish. But for now, thank you very much for listening.